Welcome to the Deep Dive. So you've shared these amazing, really comprehensive AP World History notes with us.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
There really is. And for this session, our mission basically is to pull out the biggest insights, the key moments, the connections that kind of light up the whole sweep of human history right up to today.
Exactly. We want to give you that framework, that understanding of the big picture.
Without getting totally bogged down in every single date and name, right? We've got everything here from early civilizations, major religions, all the way to globalization and, well, modern challenges.
So it's quite the journey.
It is. Okay, so where should we start? Maybe around 1200 CE. You mentioned religion being key then.
Yeah, absolutely. Around 1200, it's almost impossible to overstate how interconnected everything was with religion. It wasn't like a separate box you ticked on Sundays.
Right. It was fundamental.
Totally. It underpinned social structures, politics, culture, even, warfare. It gave legitimacy, explained the world.
Okay, so let's touch on the big ones then. Buddhism, for instance, started in India.
That's right, Siddhartha Gautama. And the core idea, those Four Noble Truths about suffering coming from desire and the path to end it, that was radical.
Especially because it rejected the caste system, right? That must have been huge in India.
Oh, absolutely huge. It wasn't just saying something different spiritually. It was a direct challenge to the social order, offering liberation based on your actions, not your birth.
So it appealed to people outside the elite.
Very much so. Lower castes, merchants, people marginalized by the Hindu system. And while it eventually faded somewhat in India itself, it spread like wildfire through trade.
Trade again. Always popping up.
Always. It carried Buddhism to China, Japan, Southeast Asia, where it really took root and transformed the societies in different ways. We see the split, too, into Theravada and Mahayana.
Okay. Then Christianity, starting as a Jewish sect.
Yep, centered on Jesus of Nazareth. The message was about devotion to God, love, forgiveness, Jesus as the Son of God.
And like Buddhism, it appealed to the lower classes and women.
Yes, that seems to be a key factor in its early growth in the Mediterranean. It offered a sense of community and worth often denied elsewhere.
And then it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. That's a massive turning point.
Monumental. Constantine's conversion, the empire's backing, that really cemented its place in Europe and shaped Western history profoundly.
Okay, switching gears to China. Confucianism. Less about God, more about society.
Exactly. Confucius was focused on social and political order. How do we create a harmonious society? His answer lay in these 5 key relationships: ruler-subject, parent-child, and so on.
Like a blueprint for living together properly.
Pretty much. And what's interesting is its compatibility. You could be Confucian in your social life, maybe Buddhist or Taoist in your spiritual life. It wasn't exclusive.
Which probably helped it last so long and shape Chinese culture so deeply.
Definitely. That adaptability was key to its resilience.
And Hinduism. Deep roots in India. Much more complex, maybe?
Very complex and ancient. You've got the core ideas of Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, concepts like dharma, moksha, reincarnation.
And the connection to the caste system, though you mentioned that's being challenged more now.
Yes, historically intertwined, though many Hindus today actively reject caste discrimination. And it's the soil from which Buddhism grew, remember. The Vedas, the Upanishads, those are the foundational texts.
Right. Okay, Islam next.
Yeah.
7th century.
Yep, with the Prophet Muhammad. Core beliefs. One God, Allah. The Quran as the holy book. The 5 pillars guiding practice.
It's spread incredibly quickly.
It's astonishingly fast, yeah. Across the Middle East, North Africa, into Spain and Persia. There was also that early split, Shia and Sunni, which is still hugely significant today.
Definitely. And finally, Judaism, the oldest of the major monotheistic faiths.
One of the very first, yes. Originating with the Hebrews, belief in one God, the idea of a chosen people, free will, the Torah as the central text.
It really laid the groundwork for Christianity and Islam, didn't it?
Absolutely. That concept of a single powerful God and an ethical code laid out in Scripture was foundational for much of Western and Middle Eastern religious thought.
Okay, so that gives us a sense of the religious landscape. But what else was happening around the globe in this post-classical era? Let's start in the Middle East, the Abbasid dynasty's golden age. Sounds impressive.
Oh, it really was.
Yeah.
Especially the 8th, 9th centuries. Baghdad under the Abbasids was arguably the intellectual capital of the world.
Wow. What made it so?
Well, the caliphs actively promoted learning. They funded the House of Wisdom, translating Greek, Persian, Indian texts, preserving and building on knowledge. Huge advancements in maths, astronomy, think of Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, medicine,
Yeah. But
philosophy.
trade was booming too. You mentioned receipts and bills.
Yeah, a sophisticated commercial network. It was a vibrant cosmopolitan center, but like all golden ages.
It didn't last. What
A
happened?
mix of things, internal fighting, regions breaking away that weakened them, but the killer blow.
Let me guess. Mongols.
Mongols. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 was just catastrophic, basically ended that era. Though it's important to note other Islamic powers rose later, like the Mamluks in Egypt, who actually stopped the Mongols, and of course the Ottomans.
Right. Okay, so meanwhile, over in Europe, it's the Middle Ages. Post-Roman Empire, sometimes seen as the Dark Ages. Fair.
Dark Ages is a bit of an outdated term, really. Things were definitely different, less centralized than the Roman Empire, sure, but stagnant. No.
So what was happening?
Well, you still had the Byzantine Empire in the East carrying on Roman traditions. In the West, you get the development of feudalism.
Ah, yes. Kings, nobles, vassals, serfs.
Right. A whole hierarchy based on land ownership and loyalty. You had manors, the three-field system improving farming, the code of chivalry for knights.
Sounds very hierarchical. What about ordinary people? And women?
Very hierarchical, yes. Women's roles were generally quite limited, tied to the home and family mostly. But you did see skilled peasants and artisans emerging, slowly forming a kind of middle class, especially later on. Serfdom wasn't quite slavery, but it tied people to the land.
And out of this feudal setup, eventually, nation-states start to form. But it happened differently everywhere.
Very differently. Take Germany, or the areas that became Germany. Lots of fragmentation, a weak central authority for a long time, an interregnum, which actually let merchant cities get quite powerful.
Interesting. And England.
England saw the nobles push back against the King Magna Carta, 1215, leading eventually to Parliament. Seeds of limited monarchy.
Right.
France forged a stronger national identity, partly through wars like the 100 Years' War against England. Figures like Joan of Arc became national symbols, more centralized monarchy there.
Spain?
Unification under Isabella and Ferdinand, closely tied to kicking out the Muslims and Jews, the Reconquista, and the Spanish Inquisition. Very much a Catholic state.
And Russia? They had the Mongols to do.
For centuries, yeah. Mongols, or Tatar, rule-shaped Russia profoundly. Then Moscow rose as the center, Ivan III, Ivan the Terrible, consolidating power, creating the Tsarist autocracy. A very different path.
Wow, okay. Let's jump over to Asia. China had the Song dynasty?
Yes, the Song. Known for amazing technological and economic progress, but also some pretty rigid social stuff, like foot binding becoming more common.
Ooh, foot binding.
Yeah. And Neo-Confucianism really took hold, blending Confucian ideas with bits of Buddhism and Taoism. Then, after the Mongols, came the Ming dynasty.
The Ming. Weren't they the ones who sent out those huge treasure fleets?
Under Zheng He, yes. Early 15th century. Incredible voyages. But then they pulled back, focused inward. Buddhism, especially Mahayana and Chan, or Zen, remained influential, though.
And Japan had its own feudal system?
It did. Very distinct. You had the emperor, but he was mostly symbolic. The real power was with the shogun, the top military commander.
Supported by the daimyo.
Exactly, the regional lords. And their warriors, the samurai, followed the code of Bushido: loyalty, honor, martial skill. Peasants and artisans were at the bottom. Again, women's roles were pretty restricted.
Okay, India. We mentioned the Delhi Sultanate, Islamic rule in the north.
Right. That brought Islam into North India as a ruling power, leading to this complex interaction with the existing Hindu culture, sometimes conflict, sometimes blending. They established colleges, improved irrigation sometimes.
But faced resistance.
Oh, yes. Particularly from the Rajput kingdoms, these Hindu warrior clans who maintained their independence in certain areas.
And Southeast Asia, we see empires like the Khmer.
Yeah, a major center of power, heavily influenced by Indian culture. First Hinduism, then Buddhism. Angkor Wat is the most stunning example of their architecture and religious devotion. They controlled key trade routes and rice-growing areas.
Okay, and Africa. Islam spreading south of the Sahara.
Definitely. Across North Africa and then down along the trade routes. This fueled the growth of states like the Hausa kingdoms in West Africa. Kano was a big center for trading salt, leather.
And the Asante Empire started to form around then, too.
Yes, the beginnings of what would become a powerful confederacy later on. Trade was the key driver for many of these states.
Right, so this whole period, roughly 1200 to 1450, sees a real increase in global interaction, doesn't it? You mentioned trade-driving urbanization earlier.
Massively. The later Middle Ages in Europe saw the rise of that merchant class, the burghers. Trade leagues like the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe became incredibly powerful.
Connecting cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, London.
Exactly. Creating wealth, fostering urban growth. You also see architectural leaps. Romanesque gives way to soaring Gothic cathedrals with flying buttresses. And intellectually, scholasticism tries to marry faith and reason in the new universities.
And the Crusades fit in here too. You said they had wider consequences.
Huge consequences. Yes, the goal was the Holy Land, but the impact was much broader. Increased contact between Europe and the Middle East, goods, ideas, technology flowed back, even amidst the fighting.
Also boosted the Pope's power for a while.
It did, yeah. Popes like Innocent III were major players. But it also led to increased intolerance, the Inquisition targeting heresies. Figures like Thomas Aquinas tried to systematize Catholic thought in response to this.
So trade leads to cities. We talked about Baghdad, but also places like Merv, Changin on the Silk Road, and later Constantinople, Paris, Venice, Genoa.
Those cities were the nodes, the connection points. Silk Road cities were vital crossroads for millennia. Constantinople was the gateway between Europe and Asia. Paris became a major cultural and political center. The Italian city-states got rich, controlling Mediterranean trade. They were melting pots, engines of change.
And then, bang, the Mongols again, Genghis Khan, building this colossal empire, more than just conquerors.
Much more, in a way. Yes, the conquests were brutal, but they created the Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, across a vast area.
Which actually helped trade. Sounds counterintuitive.
It does, but by unifying that huge landmass, they made travel safer. The Silk Road thrived under their protection. Ideas, technologies, gunpowder, printing maybe spread faster than ever between East and West.
So they facilitated cultural diffusion, even if unintentionally.
Largely, yes. They connected worlds. Think Marco Polo traveling to Kublai Khan's court in China. But their impact varied. Russia was dominated and isolated for centuries, and later conquerors like Timur Lang were more about destruction again.
Okay. Meanwhile, in West Africa, we have Mali and Songhai flourishing. Gold, Mansa Musa.
Right. Mali, especially under Mansa Musa, became legendary for its wealth, mostly from gold. His pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century put Mali on the map. Literally, European mapmakers started including it.
And Timbuktu became a center of learning.
A major center, yes. Mosques, universities, libraries full of manuscripts. Songhai, under rulers like Sani Ali, continued that tradition after Mali declined. Huge importance for Islamic scholarship in Africa.
And back in China, the Song dynasty you mentioned, tech earlier, printing press.
Movable type, yeah. Led to increased literacy. They had a merit-based civil service exam system, sophisticated transport networks, early forms of paper money, even something resembling industrial production in iron. Really advanced for its time.
So, wrapping up this period of interaction, it's an explosion of trade, right?
Yeah.
Silk Road, Indian Ocean, Trans-Saharan routes, Hanseatic League.
All buzzing. Improved ships, better navigation, banking systems developing. It all feeds into more trade.
And with trade comes cultural diffusion. Religion, languages, art, ideas.
And disease. We can't forget the bubonic plague, the Black Death, which spread along these same routes with devastating consequences in the mid-14th century.
A dark side to interconnectedness.
Definitely. But you also see vibrant multicultural communities springing up. Indian Ocean ports had Arab, Persian, Indian, African merchants intermarrying, blending cultures. Silk Road cities like Kashgar and Samarkand were melting pots.
And the Hanseatic League empowered that middle class in Europe.
Yeah, setting a precedent for large-scale European trading companies later on.
But it wasn't all trade. Empire building, religious expansion also caused movement and clashes.
True. Conquest and conversion drove a lot of interaction. But also simpler things. Population pressure, seeking opportunities in cities, religious pilgrimages like the Hajj to Mecca. People were moving for lots of reasons.
And we know about some of them through travelers like Xuanzang, Marco Polo, Ibn Battuta, Marjorie Kempe too.
Yeah, these individuals give us fascinating, though obviously subjective, glimpses into this interconnected world. Xuanzang bringing Buddhist texts to China, Polo firing up European imaginations about the East, Ibn Battuta traveling seemingly everywhere in the Islamic world, Kempe giving a laywoman's perspective on pilgrimage. Their accounts are invaluable.
Okay, so that brings us to around 1450. And this next period, up to 1750, sees, well, the rise of European dominance, doesn't it? How did that happen?
It's a convergence of factors within Europe, big shifts in thinking, technology, politics.
Starting with the Renaissance.
Italy.
Yeah, kicking off in the Italian city-states, fueled by that trade wealth we talked about, a rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman learning, art, philosophy. But with a new twist.
Humanism.
Focusing on human potential achievement, even happiness in this life.
Exactly. Less solely focused on the afterlife. You see it in the art, the realism of Leonardo da Vinci, Donatello, the ambition of Michelangelo, Brunelleschi. Wealthy patrons like the Medici family funded this explosion of creativity.
And the printing press comes in here too, Gutenberg.
Crucial timing. Gutenberg's invention around 1440 made books cheaper, knowledge spread faster, literacy increased. It powered not just the Renaissance, but the next big upheaval.
The Protestant Reformation. Challenges to the Catholic Church.
Big time. People were unhappy with corruption, practices like selling indulgences. Martin Luther, a German monk, lit the fuse in 1517.
His core idea being salvation through faith alone, not church rituals or payments.
Right. Soulified. He translated the Bible into German, challenging the church's monopoly on scripture. He gets excommunicated, but his ideas spread rapidly, helped by the printing press.
Leading to a split in Western Christianity. Lutherans, Calvinists.
Yep. John Calvin in Geneva introduced ideas like predestination, very influential. Henry VIII in England breaks with Rome for political reasons, creating the Church of England, or Anglican Church. Europe gets torn apart by religious wars for over a century.
And the Catholic Church responds?
With the Catholic Reformation, or Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent reaffirmed doctrines, tried to reform abuses. New orders like the Jesuits emerged to defend and spread Catholicism.
Okay, so religious upheaval, and then the scientific revolution. Connected.
In complex ways, the Renaissance questioning spirit, the Reformation challenging authority, it all contributed to a climate where scientific traditions could be questioned too. Plus, universities were expanding.
And we get Copernicus saying the Earth isn't the center of the universe.
The heliocentric model, yes, hugely controversial. Galileo later provided evidence with his telescope and got in big trouble with the church for it.
And the scientific method develops. Bacon.
Francis Bacon championed inductive reasoning observation experimentation. You get Kepler figuring out planetary motion, Isaac Newton with gravity and laws of motion, a fundamental shift in understanding the natural world based on evidence and mathematics.
Does this lead to less religion, atheism?
For some, yes, it certainly challenged traditional religious explanations. Deism became popular among some intellectuals, belief in a creator god who set the universe in motion but doesn't intervene.
Okay, so huge intellectual and religious changes. And politically, Europe is a mess of rivals. Spain and Portugal start strong with exploration.
They do. Early leaders in sailing down the African coast, reaching Asia, discovering the Americas. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 even tried to divide the non-European world between them.
But others catch up. England.
England, under Elizabeth I, starts challenging Spain, defeats the Armada, trading companies form, like the Muscovy Company, the British East India Company. Then you have the Stuarts, the English Civil War, Cromwell, the Restoration, the Glorious Revolution, ending with a constitutional monarchy and the Bill of Rights under William and Mary. Lots of turmoil, but setting the stage for future power.
France. Strong kings.
Very strong monarchy, especially under Louis XIV, the Sun King. Though they had their own religious conflicts with the Huguenots, the Protestants. The Edict of Nantes tried to bring peace, but Louis XIV later revoked it. France became a major continental power.
Germany. Still fragmented.
Still part of the Holy Roman Empire, which was, as Voltaire joked, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire by this point. Very weak central authority. The 30 Years' War in the early 17th century devastated the German lands, ending with the Peace of Westphalia, which sort of solidified the fragmentation but also established principles of state sovereignty.
And Russia's still consolidating, getting rid of the Mongols.
Yeah, Ivan III threw off Mongol rule officially in the late 15th century. Ivan IV, the Terrible, expanded Russian territory but was brutal. After a period of chaos, the Romanov dynasty comes in. Peter the Great in the late 17th and 18th century forces Russia to westernize, builds St. Petersburg, makes Russia a European player. Catherine the Great continues that expansion later.
Wow. Okay, while all this is happening in Europe, what about those Islamic gunpowder empires? Ottomans, Mughals.
Right, they were major forces too. The Ottoman Empire, founded by Osman Bey, conquered Constantinople in 1453, a huge symbolic and strategic victory, renamed it Istanbul.
And they use gunpowder effectively. Janissaries.
Very effectively. Cannons to break city walls. The Janissaries were an elite infantry force, often recruited through the Devshirme system from conquered Christian lands. Under rulers like Selim I and Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire reached its peak, a vast, powerful, multi-ethnic state. They used Taimars, land grants to support their cavalry.
And the Mughals in India.
Founded by Babur, a descendant of Timur Lenk and Genghis Khan. Akbar the Great is famous for his religious tolerance, trying to blend Islamic and Hindu elements. They had zamindars as local official tax collectors. Shah Jahan built the Taj Mahal. But later rulers like Aurangzeb were less tolerant, which weakened the empire just as Europeans were showing up in greater numbers.
Okay. Africa during this time.
Uh-huh.
Still trading, but feeling the impact of the slave trade more.
Definitely. Empires like Songhai were still powerful early on, Asante rising later. Wealth from trade, especially gold. But the Portuguese and later other Europeans were ramping up the transatlantic slave trade, especially from coastal regions.
Like Congo. I remember King Afonso trying to deal with the Portuguese.
Yeah, he converted to Catholicism, tried to engage with Portugal on equal terms, but ultimately couldn't stop the slave trade's devastating impact. Angola became a major source of slaves for the Portuguese colony of Brazil, despite fierce resistance from leaders like Queen Nzinga.
And Asia. China and Japan were turning inward.
Largely, yes. China, after Zheng He, the Ming, and then the Qing, who were Manchu invaders, but adopted Chinese ways focused on internal stability and carefully controlled trade with Europeans, limiting them to specific ports like Canton. Rulers like Kangxi and Qianlong oversaw periods of prosperity and expansion, but kept Europeans at arm's length.
Japan even more so.
Under the Tokugawa shogunate, starting with Ieyasu in the early 1600s, Japan entered the Edo period. They kicked out Christian missionaries, worried about foreign influence destabilizing their rule, and implemented the national seclusion policy. Only very limited trade allowed, mainly with the Dutch and Chinese at Nagasaki. Japanese culture flourished internally, though.
But even with this isolation and European expansion, people were pushing back. Resistance movements.
Always. We mentioned Queen Nzinga. You also had Cossack revolts against Russian and Polish expansion in Eastern Europe, the beginnings of what would become the Haitian Revolution much later, Maratha resistance against the Mughals in India, Maroon societies formed by escaped slaves in the Americas, Metacom's War, or King Philip's War, by Native Americans against English colonists in New England, Pueblo revolt against the Spanish in North America. Resistance was constant, though often ultimately unsuccessful against superior firepower in this era.
Right. Okay, this brings us to the next big chunk, 1750 to 1900. The age of revolutions and industrialization. European expansion kicks into even higher gear.
Oh, yeah. This is where empires really explode. Britain, France, the Dutch are building huge global empires, pushing out the earlier Spanish and Portuguese dominance in many areas. Navigation tech keeps improving chronometers for longitude, better maps.
And the impact on the New World continues to be devastating. Cortés and Pizarro were earlier, but the system they set up.
The encomienda system, yeah. Granting Spanish settlers control over native populations and their labor. It evolved over time, but the basic structure of exploitation remained, with a rigid social hierarchy. Peninsulares born in Spain at the top, Creoles of European descent born in the Americas below them, then mestizos and mulattoes of mixed heritage, and Native Americans and Africans at the bottom. Viceroys ruled in the name of the Spanish king.
And the African slave trade fueled this whole thing.
Absolutely. It peaked in the 18th century. Millions forcibly transported across the Atlantic in the horrific Middle Passage to work on sugar plantations, in mines. It fundamentally reshaped demographics and economies on both sides of the Atlantic.
You mentioned the Columbian Exchange earlier, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases. Sugar and silver were key commodities driving this.
Hugely important. Sugar drove the plantation economy and the demand for slaves. Silver from mines like Potosi in Bolivia funded the Spanish Empire and flowed across the globe, even to China. This whole era sees the commercial revolution accelerate, banking becomes more sophisticated, joint stock companies like the East India Companies allow for massive private investment in colonial ventures, and the dominant economic theory is mercantilism.
Mercantilism, the idea that wealth is finite and a nation needs to export more than it imports, grab as much gold and silver as possible. Colonies exist to benefit the mother country.
That's the core idea. Control trade, hoard wealth. It justified colonial exploitation. Trade with places like China and Japan was still limited and controlled, often on their terms at this point.
But then comes the Enlightenment, back to ideas changing things.
Big time. Building on the scientific revolution's emphasis on reason, Enlightenment thinkers questioned everything about government, society, human nature.
Challenging divine right, mandate of heaven in China.
Exactly. Concepts like the social contract that government rests on the consent of the governed put forward by thinkers like Locke and Rousseau. Montesquieu advocated separation of powers. Voltaire championed free speech and religious tolerance. Adam Smith laid the groundwork for capitalism.
And these ideas didn't stay in books, did they? They fueled actual revolutions.
Directly. The American Revolution is a prime example. Colonists used Enlightenment language about rights and representation to justify breaking away from Britain.
Triggered by taxes, no taxation without representation. Boston Tea Party.
Right. Thomas. To get back at Britain, the Declaration of Independence is pure Enlightenment thinking.
Then France has its own revolution.
Yeah.
Even more radical.
Arguably, yes. Started with the financial crisis, the Estates General meeting, then the storming of the Bastille, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. They establish a republic, execute the king.
But it gets bloody. The Reign of Terror.
Under the Jacobins and Robespierre, yeah. Thousands guillotined. Then the Directory, unstable, paving the way for Napoleon Bonaparte to seize power, eventually becoming emperor. After his defeat, the Congress of Vienna tried to put Europe back together, restore monarchies, create a balance of power.
And Haiti. A revolution led by enslaved people.
Incredible story. Led by Toussaint Louverture, then Jean-Jacques Dessalines. They defeated the French, Spanish, and British forces sent against them and established the first independent Black Republic in 1804. A beacon of hope for enslaved people everywhere and terrifying for slaveholders.
South America, too. Bolivar, San Martin.
Simón Bolívar led independence movements in Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, José de San Martin in Argentina, Chile, Peru. They fought against Spanish rule inspired by Enlightenment and revolutionary examples.
Brazil's path was different, more peaceful.
Relatively, yes. The Portuguese royal family fled there during the Napoleonic Wars. Dom Pedro declared independence later, becoming Emperor Pedro I. Brazil remained a monarchy until later in the 19th century.
And Mexico, long struggle.
Very long and complex. Started with priests like Hidalgo and Morelos leading popular uprisings. Eventually, independence was achieved, but followed by instability, conflict with the U.S., and later the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, leading to the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century. Neocolonialism, economic dependence on foreign powers remained a big issue.
And other resistance continues. Tupac Amaru II in Peru, Samari Toure in West Africa.
Yes, resistance against colonial rule and oppression was widespread. Tupac Amaru II led a major indigenous revolt against the Spanish. Samari Toure fought French expansion for years. The Sioux resisted U.S. westward expansion. Uprisings in Sudan against British-Egyptian rule. It shows that imperialism wasn't accepted passively.
Okay, so revolution. And the other big transformation, the Industrial Revolution, starts in Britain.
Yeah.
Why there?
Good question. Lots of factors. Agricultural changes like enclosure, freeing up labor, abundant coal and iron ore, rivers and canals for transport, capital available for investment from trade and colonies, a government generally supportive of business, scientific innovation.
And key inventions. Steam engine, power loom.
James Watt's improved steam engine was huge. Power looms revolutionized textile production. The factory system brought workers and machines together under one roof. Interchangeable parts, later the assembly line, radically changed how things were made.
But the conditions were terrible. Child labor.
Often appalling, yeah. Long hours, dangerous work, low pay, crowded cities with poor sanitation. Child labor was common. It created massive social disruption.
New social classes emerge. Industrial working class, middle class, factory owners.
Exactly. The old land-based aristocracy starts losing ground to the new industrial and financial elites. A large, often impoverished, urban working class develops.
And new economic theories try to explain or change this. Adam Smith versus Karl Marx.
Smith's Wealth of Nations argued for capitalism, laissez-faire, minimal government intervention, let the free market work. Marx, seeing the inequality and exploitation, argued in Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto that capitalism was inherently flawed and would be overthrown by a workers' revolution, leading to communism, a classless society. Socialism offered a middle ground, advocating for reforms and greater social ownership.
Did things improve for workers? Reforms? Unions?
Slowly, yes. Things like the Factory Acts in Britain started limiting child labor and working hours. Labor unions formed to fight for better wages and conditions, though often facing harsh opposition. Living standards did eventually start to rise for many, partly due to these struggles and reforms. Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, then slavery itself in its empire in 1833. Women's roles saw some shifts, but they still faced major limitations.
And alongside industry, nationalism really takes off in the 19th century.
It becomes a dominant force. The idea of loyalty to your nation, people sharing a common language, culture, history, wanting their own independent state.
We see it in the French Revolution, but it spreads. Unification of Italy and Germany.
Definitely. Italy was unified by figures like Cavour and Garibaldi under King Victor Emmanuel II by 1870. Germany was unified under the leadership of Prussia's Otto von Bismarck through clever diplomacy and wars, creating the German Empire in 1871 under Kaiser Wilhelm I.
Other empires feeling the pressure of nationalism. Russia. Ottomans.
Yes. Russia had nationalist movements among Poles, Finns, etc. Alexander II tried reforms like emancipating the serfs, but was assassinated. Alexander III cracked down. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, faced nationalist revolts in the Balkans, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria. They tried reforms, Tanzimat, but struggled to hold the multi-ethnic empire together. Nationalism was reshaping the map.
So industrial power and nationalism fuel more imperialism.
Mhm.
A scramble for resources.
Precisely. The late 19th century is the peak of new imperialism. Industrial factories needed raw materials, rubber, copper, tin, oil, cotton, and they needed markets to sell their manufactured goods. Colonies provided both.
And this often damaged the environment in the colonies, depleted resources.
Absolutely. Extraction was the goal, often with little regard for long-term sustainability or local impact. Transnational businesses emerged, operating across borders to exploit these resources.
And the justification was civilizing missions, social Darwinism.
Yeah, those ideologies were used to rationalize it. Ethnocentrism, believing European culture was superior. Social Darwinism twisted Darwin's ideas to suggest some races were naturally fitter to rule. Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, captured that paternalistic, condescending attitude, the supposed moral obligation to uplift colonized peoples, while ignoring the exploitation involved.
Let's look at some examples. India under the British Raj.
After the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857, the British government took direct control from the East India Company. India became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, a huge source of resources and manpower. But Indian nationalism started to grow, with groups like the Indian National Congress forming late in the century.
China, still resisting, but facing pressure. Opium Wars.
China tried to resist European influence and the opium trade pushed by Britain. But they lost the Opium Wars, were forced to sign unequal treaties like the Treaty of Nanjing, cede territory, Hong Kong, open ports, and grant spheres of influence to various powers. Internal rebellions, like the Taiping Rebellion, weakened the Qing dynasty further. They tried reforms, self-strengthening movement, but lost wars to France and then Japan, Treaty of Shimonoseki. The U.S. proposed the open door policy to ensure everyone could trade, but it didn't stop encroachment. The Boxer Rebellion was an anti-foreign uprising crushed by international forces. The imperial system was crumbling.
Japan, though, took a different path. Meiji Restoration.
Completely different. After U.S. Commodore Perry forced Japan to open up in the 1850s, Treaty of Kanagawa, Japan realized it needed to modernize to avoid China's fate. The Meiji Restoration saw rapid industrialization, military buildup, adoption of Western technology and political models, but adapted to Japanese culture.
And they became an imperial power themselves.
Astonishingly quickly. They defeated China, then Russia, in 1905, a huge shock, annexed Korea, took Taiwan. They played the imperial game, reducing European influence in East Asia.
And Africa, the scramble for Africa.
The interior was largely unknown to Europeans until the late 19th century. Exploration increased, the slave trade was mostly abolished, though forced labor often continued. Then came the scramble. Britain took Egypt, controlling the vital Suez Canal built by the French Egyptians, fought the Boers, Dutch settlers in South Africa. King Leopold II of Belgium committed horrific atrocities in the Congo Free State. The Berlin Conference, 1884-85, saw European powers carve up almost the entire continent among themselves, drawing lines on maps with no regard for existing African societies or ethnicities. Resistance was widespread, but usually overcome by European weaponry.
Even the U.S. got more involved overseas. Monroe Doctrine evolves.
The Monroe Doctrine initially aimed to keep European powers out of the Americas. The Roosevelt Corollary later asserted the U.S. right to intervene in Latin American affairs to protect its interests. The U.S. built the Panama Canal, fought the Spanish-American War, gaining Cuba as a protectorate, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, expanding its influence.
Okay, so this intense competition, imperialism, nationalism, it all leads into the 20th century and World War I.
It's the perfect storm. You've got these rigid alliance systems, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, and the Triple Entente, France, Russia, Britain. Intense nationalism, especially in the Balkans, a massive arms race, particularly between Britain and Germany navy-wise. Militarism was rampant.
And the spark is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
In Sarajevo, June 1914, Austria-Hungary blames Serbia, issues an ultimatum. Russia backs Serbia, Germany backs Austria-Hungary. The alliances kick in, and suddenly Europe is at war. Germany's Schlieffen Plan aimed for a quick victory over France by going through neutral Belgium, which brought Britain in.
Central powers versus Allied powers. It becomes a brutal trench warfare stalemate.
Horrific. Machine guns, artillery, poison gas. Unimaginable slaughter for years. The U.S. stayed out initially isolationism.
What brings the U.S. in?
German unrestricted submarine warfare sinking ships like the Lusitania and the Zimmermann telegram, where Germany tried to get Mexico to attack the U.S. Wilson asked Congress to declare war in 1917 to make the world safe for democracy. U.S. entry tipped the balance.
And the war ends with the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson's 14 points.
Wilson had idealistic goals for peace, including the League of Nations. But the treaty imposed harsh terms on Germany, blame for the war, massive reparations, loss of territory. Many felt it was too punitive, and ironically, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty or join the League of Nations.
While WWI is raging, Russia has its revolution.
Yes, 1917. Tsar Nicholas II is overthrown. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seize power in the October Revolution. Lenin's April theses promised peace, land, and bread. They pull Russia out of the war with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ceding huge territories to Germany, establish the Soviet Union, and fight a bloody civil war against anti-communist white forces, eventually winning under Trotsky's leadership of the Red Army.
And the Ottoman Empire collapses too.
Yes, they were on the losing side. The empire was dismantled. During the war, the horrific Armenian genocide occurred. Turkey emerged as a modern republic under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk.
So post-WWI, the world looks very different, but not necessarily peaceful. We get the USSR under Stalin.
After Lenin's death, Stalin consolidated power. He abandoned the NEP new economic policy, which allowed some capitalism, and launched the brutal 5-year plans for rapid industrialization and collectivization of agriculture, forcing peasants onto state farms. Millions died from famine and purges, totalitarian control.
And the Great Depression hits globally.
Starting with the U.S. stock market crash in 1929, it spread worldwide. Massive unemployment, economic collapse. It created fertile ground for extremist ideologies.
Like fascism in Italy? Mussolini.
Exactly. Mussolini and his black shirts came to power in the 1920s, promising order and national glory, suppressing opposition. Fascism emphasized nationalism, militarism, and state control.
And in Germany, Hitler and the Nazis rise.
The weak Weimar Republic struggled with the Depression and Versailles resentment. Hitler's Nazi party offered scapegoats, Jews, communists, and promised to restore German greatness. He became chancellor in 1933, quickly established a dictatorship, the Third Reich, and began rearming and violating the Versailles Treaty.
The policy towards Hitler was appeasement.
Mostly, yes. Britain and France hoped to avoid another war. They let Hitler remilitarize the Rhineland, didn't intervene decisively in the Spanish Civil War, where Hitler and Mussolini backed Franco, allowed the annexation of Austria, Anschluss, and agreed to give him the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia at the Munich Conference in 1938.
But it didn't work.
Nope. Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia, then signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin, the Nazi-Soviet pact, shocking the world, to carve up Poland. When he invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain and France finally declared war. World War II began.
Japan was also aggressive in Asia.
Very much so. They'd allied with Britain earlier but faced economic problems during the Depression. Militarists gained control, invaded Manchuria in 1931, creating the puppet state, Manchukuo, signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Germany against communism, and launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937.
So WWII, Blitzkrieg, Battle of Britain, invasion of the USSR, Pearl Harbor.
Germany's lightning war tactics were initially very successful. Britain held out against air attacks. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 was a crucial turning point, bogging down huge German forces. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the U.S. into the war globally. The U.S. also initiated the secret Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb.
And the tide turns, D-Day.
Allied victories in North Africa, Italy. Then the massive D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944 opened the Western Front in Europe. The Soviets pushed from the east. Germany surrendered in May 1945.
And the end of the Pacific.
After fierce island-hopping campaigns, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Japan surrendered shortly after. The war was over.
But the consequences were immense. The Holocaust.
The systematic genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others by the Nazis. Unspeakable horror.
And the peace settlement. A new world order.
Germany and Japan were occupied and demilitarized. The U.S. and USSR emerged as the two dominant superpowers, setting the stage for the Cold War. Europe was devastated, leading to efforts like the Marshall Plan, U.S. aid for reconstruction. Colonialism began to unravel faster. Women's roles changed again due to wartime work. And international organizations were created, the United Nations, aiming to prevent future wars, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the World Bank, IMF, GATT, later WTO, to manage the global economy.
So immediately after WWII, we slide into the Cold War, U.S. versus USSR.
Pretty much immediately. Ideological conflict. U.S.-led capitalist West versus Soviet-led communist East. An arms race, especially nuclear weapons. Competition for influence everywhere.
How did the post-war power grab happen? Yalta and Potsdam.
At those conferences, the Allies tried to decide the future of Europe. But disagreements, especially over Eastern Europe where Soviet armies were present, led to division. Churchill famously spoke of an iron curtain descending across the continent.
Berlin becomes a flashpoint. Blockade, airlift, wall.
Germany and Berlin itself were divided into occupation zones. Stalin blockaded West Berlin in 1948. The U.S. responded with the Berlin airlift. Later, in 1961, East Germany built the Berlin Wall to stop people fleeing to the West. It became the symbol of the Cold War division.
And military alliances form. NATO versus Warsaw Pact.
Yep, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was the Western military alliance led by the U.S. The Warsaw Pact was the Soviet equivalent for Eastern Europe. Many newly independent nations tried to stay out of these blocs, forming the Non-Aligned Movement, Bandung Conference in 1955.
China has its revolution during this time, too. Mao.
The Chinese Civil War resumed after WWII. Mao Zedong's communists defeated Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, Kuomintang KMT, who fled to Taiwan. Mao proclaimed the People's Republic of China, PRC, in 1949. Taiwan remained the Republic of China, recognized by the U.S. for decades.
Mao's rule. Great leap forward, cultural revolution.
Yeah, periods of massive upheaval. The Great Leap Forward was a disastrous attempt at rapid industrialization and collectivization, leading to famine. The Cultural Revolution was a chaotic campaign against perceived enemies of the revolution, targeting intellectuals, traditional culture. After Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping introduced market-based economic reforms, opening China up, though maintaining strict political control, as seen in the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989.
Korea gets divided, too, leading to war.
After WWII, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel. North Korea, backed by the Soviets, invaded South Korea, backed by the US-UN in 1950. The Korean War saw US-UN forces under MacArthur push north, then China intervened, pushing them back. Ended in a stalemate and armistice in 1953, with the division still in place today.
And Vietnam, another Cold War proxy war.
France tried to reclaim its colony, French Indochina, after WWII, but was defeated by Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh forces. Vietnam was divided. The U.S. got heavily involved supporting South Vietnam against the Communist North and Viet Cong insurgents, fearing a domino effect. It became a long, brutal, divisive war for America, ending with a communist takeover in 1975.
Nearby Cambodia suffered terribly too. Khmer Rouge.
Yes, the communist Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot took power and carried out a horrific genocide in the late 1970s, killing roughly a quarter of the population in their quest for an agrarian utopia.
And Cuba. Castro. Missile crisis.
Fidel Castro overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator Batista in 1959. The U.S. tried to overthrow him with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Then, in 1962, the discovery of Soviet nuclear missile sites in Cuba led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, probably the closest the world came to nuclear war during the Cold War.
Latin America generally saw a lot of U.S. influence and instability during the Cold War.
Yeah, the U.S. often backed anti-communist regimes, even dictatorships, fearing Soviet influence. This led to cycles of revolution, military coups, civil wars in places like Nicaragua, El Salvador, Chile. Many countries struggled with debt, export-oriented economies, and transitions towards democracy, like Mexico.
So how did the Cold War finally end?
A combination of factors. Soviet economic stagnation, the costly arms race, especially Reagan's buildup, growing dissent within the Eastern Bloc, like the Solidarity movement in Poland led by Lech Walesa, and reforms introduced by the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Perestroika and glasnost.
Right. Perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Gorbachev hoped to reform communism, but instead it unleashed forces that led to its collapse. Revolutions swept Eastern Europe in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, Germany reunified.
And the Soviet Union itself breaks apart.
In 1991, yes, it disintegrated into independent nations. This led to new conflicts, like ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia, the Balkans. New democracies emerged, but Russia itself, under Yeltsin and later Putin, has had a complex relationship with democracy and authoritarianism. The U.S. was left as the world's sole superpower for a while.
While the Cold War was ending, decolonization was in full swing in Asia and Africa. India.
India's independence movement, led by figures like Gandhi, advocating nonviolent passive resistance, and Nehru of the Indian National Congress and Muhammad Ali Jinnah of the Muslim League, achieved success after WWII. But fears between Hindus and Muslims led to the partition of British India into India and Pakistan in 1947.
Which was incredibly violent.
Tragically violent.
Yeah.
Massive population exchanges, widespread massacres, ongoing tensions, especially over Kashmir.
Africa's path to independence. Also complex.
Very. Movements like the African National Congress, ANC, in South Africa fought against white minority rule. Leaders like Gamal Nasser in Egypt challenged colonial influence. Ghana was the first sub-Saharan colony to gain independence peacefully. Others like Algeria, Kenya, Angola fought protracted wars. The Belgian Congo descended into chaos. Zimbabwe had a long struggle. The African Union was formed later to promote cooperation. But many nations faced huge challenges: arbitrary borders drawn by colonizers, ethnic conflicts, weak economies, corruption, leading to ongoing conflicts in places like Chad, Sudan, Uganda, Somalia, Rwanda.
The Rwandan genocide in 1994. Hutu and Tutsi.
A horrific example of ethnic conflict exploding, resulting in the slaughter of hundreds of thousands, mostly Tutsi, by Hutu extremists.
And South Africa had apartheid. Mandela.
Apartheid was a brutal system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination. Nelson Mandela and the ANC led the fight against it, facing imprisonment and violence like the Sharpeville Massacre. International pressure eventually helped lead to the end of apartheid in the early 1990s and Mandela becoming president.
The Middle East, after WWII, mandates end, Israel is created.
The French and British mandates ended. Saudi Arabia emerged as a kingdom built on oil wealth. But the biggest issue was the creation of modern Israel in 1948. Zionism, the movement for a Jewish homeland, gained momentum after the Holocaust, fueled by the earlier Balfour Declaration from Britain.
Leading to conflict with Arab states.
Immediately. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War, followed by more wars, like the Six-Day War in 1967, where Israel occupied more territory. The Camp David Accords brought peace between Israel, Begin, and Egypt, Sadat. But the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict, involving the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and others, continues to this day.
Iran had its revolution too.
In 1979, the U.S.-backed Shah was overthrown and Ayatollah Khomeini established an Islamic Republic. This led to the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, and oil, through OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, became a major geopolitical factor.
Okay, that takes us roughly to the 1990s and the current era of globalization.
Yeah.
Marked by terrorism.
Sadly, yes. The post-Cold War era saw the rise of new threats. International security efforts increased through NATO, the UN, the International Criminal Court, ICC, NGOs. We had the first Gulf War after Iraq invaded Kuwait. Then the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan, al-Qaeda led by Osama bin Laden.
And Laden connected to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
He fought against the Soviets there, yeah.
Yeah.
Later turned against the U.S. His al-Qaeda network carried out the 9/11 attacks on the U.S. in 2001.
Leading to the War on Terror. Afghanistan, Iraq.
Yes, the U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban who harbored al-Qaeda, and the controversial U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 to remove Saddam Hussein, based on claims, later proved false, about weapons of mass destruction. Ongoing instability in the region.
But globalization also means more trade and cultural exchange.
Definitely. The end of the Cold War, the rise of the internet, it accelerated global interconnectedness. Trade agreements like NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, the expansion of the European Union, EU with its Eurozone currency. English became the dominant language of global business.
And global culture. Olympics, World Cup.
Yeah, shared cultural experiences. Music like reggae spreading globally, Bollywood films, social media connecting people instantly, even McDonald's becoming a symbol, for better or worse, of cultural globalization.
And the rise of China and India as major economic powers.
Huge shift in the global balance. Both face internal challenges, but their economic growth has been transformative. International groups like the G20 reflect this changing landscape, moving beyond the older G7, G8 of established industrial nations. The WTO tries to regulate global trade.
Globalization also highlights environmental issues. global warming.
Absolutely. Increased production, consumption, travel, it all impacts the environment. The Green Revolution boosted food production but had its own environmental costs. Climate change has become a major global concern, requiring international cooperation.
And global health crises,
Yeah.
AIDS, pandemics.
Diseases cross borders more easily, too. AIDS emerged as a major global health crisis. Organizations like the World Health Organization, WHO, try to coordinate responses. We see disparities in healthcare access globally. Recent pandemics have really underscored our interconnectedness and vulnerability.
And finally, the age of the computer. Internet, social media, changing everything.
Fundamentally, personal computers, the internet, smartphones, social media, they've revolutionized communication, information, work, entertainment, but also raised new issues around government surveillance, data privacy, misinformation. It's constantly evolving.
So looking back at this incredible journey, millennia of history,
Hmm.
what are the big takeaways? We've seen civilizations rise and fall, religions shape societies, trade and tech transform everything, power struggles, independence movements, and now this intense globalization.
It's a complex tapestry, isn't it? You see these recurring patterns. Innovation driving change, the tension between local identity and larger forces, the constant interaction and exchange between cultures, sometimes peaceful, often not, power shifts, empires rise and fall, but humanity adapts, connects, and continues to build and sometimes destroy.
It really gives you perspective on today's world.
Yeah.
Understanding those current belief systems, economic drivers, political ambitions that have shaped where we are now, you get a framework, like you said at the start.
Exactly. And seeing how interconnected events have always been, even before modern globalization. What happened in one part of the world often had ripple effects far away, just maybe slower than today.
Right. So here's a final thought then. We've seen these cycles of conflict and cooperation, empires rising and falling, driven by belief, resources, technology. Now, with globalization and the sheer speed of technological change today, how might power dynamics and cultural exchanges look in the next 100 years? Will the old patterns hold, or are we entering something completely new?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? What new challenges, what new opportunities will this incredibly fast-paced, interconnected world bring? History gives us clues, but the future, well, that's still being written.
Definitely something for all of us to think about. Thanks for taking us through this incredible sweep of history.
My pleasure. It's always fascinating to trace these connections.